Hello, in this video we will talk about the developmental states, Japan, South Korea and Taiwan in the post-war period and the aftermath, of course. In the second half of 20th century, these three countries achieved significant developments, both regarding their economic spheres as well as in the political paradigm. Of course, within the international history, we will not just talk about their foreign relations, but also the relation between their domestic politics as well as their international politics. So mainly, of course, we will talk about Japan in general. Of course, it's although of course we do not put them into any kind of an hierarchy, but especially the conditions or the conjuncture of Japan is relatively much more significant in the case of course, Cold War paradigm. But also, of course, South Korea and Taiwan were significant countries, not just as the so-called models of modernization theory, but also, of course, their symbolic and strategic significance in the second half of 20th century. So we will, of course, begin with some of these questions. We will ask, first of all, how did such an occupied country like Japan, which was also devastated after the Second World War, managed to become the second largest economy in less than 30 years. This is a significant achievement, and the way in which it was, of course, realized was depending on both domestic conditions as well as international politics. Similarly, the other two countries, South Korea and Taiwan, had remarkable success in terms of their economic development. We will, of course, will talk about the economic development in these countries, especially with regard to their technological sectors, and how did they manage to achieve such export-oriented developments. And finally, of course, we should also ask some kind of negative questions as well. Why didn't other countries in Asia, in Southeast Asia, were not that successful? Of course, there are other cases of relative economic success compared to these countries, but compared to these countries, they were not that successful. And we will, of course, ask the impact of the Cold War paradigm as well as development paradigm. And finally, the impact of decolonization in all these processes. So looking at the contents of what we are going to cover is, of course, begins with the American occupation of Japan in the Second World War. Of course, Japan was defeated by the American armies, by the Allied powers, of course, but mainly the American Navy. Finally, of course, with its huge domestic economy, with the support of its logistical structure, managed to defeat the Japanese Navy. And afterwards, of course, it was literally and figuratively occupied by the American forces. So we will begin with American occupation and how the Supreme Commander of Allied powers managed to shape the initial structure, or political as well as economic structure of this country. But later, with the 1955 system, a new era began in Japan. We will talk about it and its impact, of course, regarding the negotiations with the United States for the security treaty. We will talk about these almost three decades of ongoing non-stop economic development, this high-speed growth, and of course the problems, the repercussions of it as well. And finally, Japan becoming a super economic power, but with regard to other, of course, international and diplomatic impact, compared to other developed or industrialized countries, its power is much more smaller and much more diminished. So we will talk about these sides, these dimensions as well. And finally, in the aftermath of this non-stop economic growth came the, of course, deflationist and stagnated economy, a kind of a post-bubble Japan. We will talk about its impact in the contemporary Japan and Japanese economy as well as society. And finally, we will talk about these two other examples, South Korea and Taiwan, how they in some ways mimicked the Japanese development, but in some ways they had also their unique aspects in terms of this concept of development states developmental states, which I will explain in a minute. So let's start with the American occupation of Japan and how this post-war era began to redefine the Japanese society, Japanese political system. As you know, the official surrender came at the end of 1945, on September 2nd, 1945. Finally, the Japanese Empire accepted the Supreme Commander of Allied Powers control, and this was a direct control actually. The General MacArthur and SCAP directly began to shape the political system in Japan, and in 1947 it was literally written by the Americans. The new constitution, the new structure that was established in Japan was literally shaped by the American advisors. And in this process, in this immediate aftermath of the Second World War, they were trying to establish a democratic and pluralistic society in order to prevent any possible colonialistic ambitions by Japan again. Because as you know, Japan during the, of course, interwar period began to invade not just smaller islands, but also the peninsula of Korea, Manchuria, and one by one their ambitions was enlarging up until the Second World War. And in order to not repeat these mistakes, the Americans were thinking of establishing a democratic system in the country so that they could in some ways prevent a militarized society, a militarized, of course, political system. So within this new constitution, Japan even accepted to renounce all kinds of going into war and even establishing and having an armed forces. So the Japanese army was completely dismantled, and it was defended literally by the American forces. So it was, of course, a kind of a reluctant consent given by the Japanese administrators, because they, first of all, they didn't have any choice, but also they realized that without engaging in any kind of military expenditure, they would also focus on the revitalization of their economy and recovery of Japan in general. But the developments in the post-war period made the Americans realize that it wasn't just possible to democratize and pluralize the society, but also they needed to reverse course and try to not just focus on the political aspects of it, but also help Japanese economy to recover, because they first of all realized this socialist tendencies was developing within Japan, but also around Asia and Southeast Asia, these socialist and communist, of course, tendencies was enlarging and expanding throughout the continent and beyond. So in order to prevent all these developments and make Japan as a model of capitalist development as well, so they reversed their course and they began to support the economic recovery of Japan, and eventually even help them to rearm themselves and defend themselves so that it couldn't be a long-term burden for the American economy. But this second part couldn't be achieved fully, even into some extent today. So all these back and forth decision making resulted in the 1955 San Francisco Peace Treaty, and with this treaty, actually technically and officially, the occupation has ended. So literally they gave the key back to the Japanese administration and told them that so long as that you are within our security theater, this Japanese security treaty was signed in order to realize that, so that all these US bases could be kept within the Japanese soil, but also they could provide the necessary logistics for a possible intervention in the Japanese sphere. So of course the existence of these US bases has been they have been quite controversial and resulted in a lot of protests within Japanese society, which we will talk about in a minute. And out of this, of course, the end of occupation, a new system was slowly began to be shaped by the Japanese politics, and we call this 1955 system. And within this 1955 system, actually two things happened. First of all, on the left side of the spectrum of politics, the Japanese Socialist Party merged all these different fractions within the left. And on the right side, Liberal Democratic Party managed to unite all these center-right groups, as well as to some extent far-right groups as well, within its under its umbrella, and managed to actually stay almost for 40 years of power. So throughout the late 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s onwards, just single party managed to keep the, of course, power in its hand. And this was, of course, done with the help of the American administration as well. But in the early 50s, the American administrations, Eisenhower administration and onwards, they were actually trying to press Japan to establish their own proper army. And with the 54 self-defense force, actually, Japan accepted it, but it still maximized its current expense. So all these normalizations in the political life, of course, were also reflected in the international dimension. For example, Ataye administration was trying to normalize the relations between Japan and Soviet Union so that they could realize the international stability for their country's economic and political development. So in that sense, first of all, they began mutual diplomatic recognition of each other with a formal peace treaty. Also, USSR waived its veto over Japanese participation and membership in the United Nations. So later, of course, Kishi administration was taking a much more militarized identification for Japan. They were much more nationalistic in their tendencies. But of course, this brought a lot of protests over the revision of the security treaty. And Kishi administration was actually forced to resign from their position. So the 1960s protests over the revision of this security treaty and trying to remilitarize to some extent the country, because there were a lot of suspicions towards the Kishi's ambitious their plan. On the left side of the spectrum, of course, there were a lot of protests within the students and all kinds of non-governmental organizations. So the new administration by Ikeda was trying to forget about all these political instabilities and try to recover the economy by focusing on growth-oriented development. And they were calling the income doubling. And actually, throughout the 60s and 70s, 80s onwards, they were not just doubling the economy, the income of the per capita, but also even tripling and even quadrupling as well. That's how they managed to achieve this. And of course, if you look at the mechanisms behind this high-speed growth, of course, it was creating its own problems and inequalities within country. Of course, this fast-growing economy was not completely egalitarian for all the sectors or the segments of society. But if we look at how this mechanism worked, we can say that it actually done by the guidance of the state institutions, especially the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, had a direct control over the economic planning. Of course, this wasn't some kind of a socialist type of state planning, but it was done in conjunction with the cooperation between the state bureaucrats and the business elites, which were so-called keiretsus. And these, of course, sui generis type of relationship was Johnson was calling this phenomenon as developmental state. So the state was directly controlling the planning, but of course was doing all this planning for the market economy. So this state-oriented market economy actually managed to provide a high-speed growth throughout the 70s and 80s. A lot of course, conglomerates, big holdings groups, those business groups were supported by the state and beginning to be real competitors against their Western counterparts. And this was all done with the, of course, protectionist policies as well. They were trying to protect their economy from foreign infiltration. Of course, as you know, in the post-war period, this would be seen as a kind of a threat to free market economy by the United States, but they actually acquiesced, accepted tacitly, so that the Japanese economy would grow and could be a kind of a model for the rest of the world as well. And other developments within the region in the Cold War paradigm also benefited Japanese economy as well. For example, the war in Vietnam, the war in Korea, all these wars were actually supporting the Japanese exports, and they're of course purchased by not just American army, but other armies, but also other countries as well. But at the end of 60s, of course, US determination to keep this Bretton Woods system, to have this somewhat stabilized economy, couldn't be sustained. So with the Nixon doctrine, by reducing US commitments in the region and of course retreating their direct support for this fixed dollar exchange system, was kind of a shock for the Japanese economy, especially dollar's devaluation and later the imposed import surcharges were in a way a reaction to the highly competitive Japanese products, especially as you know Japanese cars were in a way infiltrating the US economy, and they were becoming even replacing the American car production system. In this sense, we can say by the 80s, Japan was an economic superpower, although it wasn't supported with a political or diplomatic power. But in terms of being a leading figure of Group 7, G7, the biggest 7 economies in the world, they were trying to, of course, engage in an omnidirectional diplomacy, because the 70s showed them, especially 1973 oil shock, showed them that they had to take a kind of a reluctant, maybe a pro-Arab stance, so that they could secure these oil products. But also they were trying to gain influence by supporting ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia with developmental aids, and they were trying to recover their relationship with the People's Republic of China. So this kind of an omnidirectional diplomacy was of course reactions to the slowing down economy in Japan as well. So their contribution to the Plaza Accord and accepting this changing structure within the world economy was a result of it. But while they were trying to re-engage in armament and maybe get over their traumas, where they were in a way swinging in between these different understandings throughout this transitional period in the second half of 80s, as well as in the second half of 70s, actually in the first half of 80s onwards. So the end of 80s, of course, with the end of the Cold War, this 1955 system was experiencing its own end as well, because people were beginning to realize this system was kept by the supposed threat of a possible socialist infiltration and this ongoing support of the business elite by the state bureaucracy. So this brought, of course, reactions from the conservative sides as well. For example, as you can see on the left, Ichiro Ozawa and all these people who were actually acting like shadow chancellors, they were trying to unite the left with the conservative center so that they could get rid of this 1955 system, and they managed to do it actually. But of course, this period of early 1990s coincided with a prolonged economic slump. This was in the end result of course, pushing a lot of flooding the economy with money, which created actually loosening rules over the financial speculation. That led to, of course, a bubble economy. And this created its own debt burden problems, which also coincided with the Asian crisis of 1997. So at the end, we can see this good old high-speed growth days were over for Japanese economy. And still throughout the 2000s and 2010s, we are seeing a much more stagnant economy in Japan. All these Koizumi administrations, Abe administrations, trying to boost spending and flooding money were still not enough. Of course, comparatively, looking at the economy right now, of course, by 2010, the Chinese economy managed to become the second largest economy, but still, as the third largest economy, Japan is, of course, still quite strong compared to other countries. So looking at finally these two examples, South Korea and Taiwan, we see a kind of a resemblance in terms of their developmental state features. First of all, of course, we should mention that South Korea is actually technically called the Republic of Korea, but we usually colloquially refer it as known as South Korea. And on the other hand, Taiwan is actually technically the Republic of China, which is not recognized by the People's Republic of China, and that's why we usually know it as Taiwan. Both of these countries, as you can see, started with authoritarian governments. In the case of Korea, ruled until 1960. Later, they experienced a coup d'etat, kind of a militaristic junta control, and state-oriented economic growth. In the case of Taiwan, of course, the authoritarian regime of Kuomintang continued even decades in the country, and they always, of course, was beginning to shift from import substitution to export-oriented models. They were both models in that sense for this so-called modernization theory. Although many people still say that modernization theory is over, it's no longer viable, it's not has any kind of a prestige, still in the mindset of a lot of, especially Western thinkers, we can see the remnants of this ideology, showing some economies as a symbols or success stories of market-oriented development. And in this case, of course, South Korea and Taiwan were quite literally important and significant samples. But in the late 80s and 90s, they were also experiencing political problems with the changing winds and the end of Cold War, of course. Democratization was slowly infiltrating into these countries, but with the 1997 Asian flu crisis, their economic development was slowing down together with Japan as well. But at the end, if we look at their giant companies and giant conglomerates, you can see in the case of South Korea, for example, LG, Samsung, Kia, Hyundai, all these, of course, brands became symbols for these countries and the stories of success for them. So if we wrap up and look at how this developmental state theory or this conceptualization could explain these three countries, we can see in all of them in the post-war period, they all started with an import substitution. They were trying to support their infant industries. They were making them viable with, of course, support of their protectionist policies. And they were also under the umbrella of security system of the United States of America. So they didn't have to spend a lot of for their military production and military, of course, arms and deals. Also, they were all state-sponsored heavy industrialization endeavors, and they were always done with the tacit consent of the United States. Although they were part of the general agreements on trade and tariffs, although they accepted free trade, supposedly free trade, but of course they were always complemented with protectionist policies as well. And the reason why they were even allowed in the international context was, of course, these countries' strategic and symbolic value. Strategic because of their, of course, proximity to People's Republic of China and the USSR, but symbolic for the other countries in the third world, so that they could be shown as success stories of the capitalist development endeavor. So these three cases, in a way, could explain as some examples of this development paradigm in the second half of 20th century. In the next chapter, we will talk about the other side of the story, People's Republic of China and North Korea. Thank you for watching.